Today we're talking about rosemary, and specifically about the things I learned that completely changed how mine grows. Rosemary has a reputation as the herb you cannot kill. Drought-tolerant, low maintenance, practically indestructible. That reputation is completely accurate, in the right conditions. But if you have ever watched a rosemary plant turn brown and die in your kitchen window despite careful watering, or bought one from a grocery store that looked perfect for 2 weeks and then collapsed without warning, or grown one outdoors that never thrives no matter what you try, then you already know the reputation is missing something important. What it is missing is this: rosemary is not a houseplant. It never was. And the moment you start caring for it like one, you begin a slow process of killing it with the exact care that would keep everything else in your home alive. The watering that saves your basil drowns your rosemary. The rich potting mix that feeds your tomatoes rots your rosemary roots. The warm, humid indoor air that your tropical plants love creates the perfect conditions for powdery mildew to destroy your rosemary from the inside out. In this video, I am going to give you 8 things about rosemary that completely changed how it grows. Starting with the one reframe that makes every other tip in this video make immediate sense. This is exactly what this channel publishes every single week. Plant care built on biology, not generic advice. Subscribe now so the next video finds you directly the moment it goes live. Hit that button now. By the time this is over, you will not just know how to keep rosemary alive. You will understand why it behaves the way it does. And that understanding is the difference between a plant that survives and one that genuinely thrives. Lesson 1. Stop thinking of it as a houseplant. Rosemary is a woody perennial shrub native to the rocky coastal hillsides of the Mediterranean, southern France, Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey. In its natural habitat, it grows in full blazing sun on slopes with almost no soil, endures months without rain, withstands salt spray off the ocean, and deals with constant wind moving through its foliage every hour of every day. In the right conditions, it grows 4 to 6 feet tall and lives for decades. It is essentially a small tree that smells incredible. When you bring that plant inside and set it on a kitchen counter in still air, weak light, rich potting mix, and water it twice a week because that is what you do with herbs, you have placed a coastal Mediterranean shrub into conditions it was never built to handle. It does not die because you did something wrong in the conventional sense. It dies because everything that counts as good houseplant care is the opposite of what rosemary needs. Once that distinction locks in, every lesson that follows will feel obvious rather than counterintuitive. You are not trying to pamper rosemary. You are trying to approximate a rocky hillside in the south of France. That is the entire job. Lesson 2. It needs more light than you think. Significantly more. Light is the single most common reason indoor rosemary fails. Not overwatering, not underwatering, not the wrong soil. Light starvation. Rosemary requires a minimum of 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight daily, not bright indirect light, not the ambient glow from a window across the room, but actual sun hitting the needle-like leaves for 6 to 8 hours. Most indoor spots that feel bright to the human eye are delivering 2 to 3 hours of direct light at most. To rosemary, that is starvation. When light drops below what the plant can use for photosynthesis, it begins shedding leaves from the inside out to reduce its maintenance burden. The interior of the plant goes brown and bare, while the outer tips still look green. By the time the outer tips begin dying, the decline is already advanced. Most people misread this as a watering problem and begin adjusting water when the actual fix was always light. Indoors, the plant goes in your brightest south-facing window without negotiation. If you do not have one, a grow light positioned within a few inches of the foliage running 10 to 12 hours daily is not optional. It is the minimum threshold for survival. Outdoors, rosemary goes in your most sun-exposed location, ideally against a south-facing wall, which reflects additional light and radiates stored heat at night, extending the warm microclimate the plant prefers. The test is simple. If the spot cannot support a full-season tomato plant, it cannot support rosemary. Lesson 3 is coming up, and it is the one that trips up experienced gardeners most, because the watering rule for rosemary runs directly opposite to every other herb you have ever grown. Stay with me. And Lesson 6 is the indoor overwintering mistake that kills more established rosemary plants than anything else on this list. That one is coming. If you are not subscribed yet, hit that button now. Plant care built around what actually works, every week. Subscribe so the next video reaches you directly. Lesson 3. The watering rule that goes against every instinct. The advice most people follow is that rosemary is drought tolerant, so water it less. That is partially correct and dangerously incomplete. Rosemary does hate sitting in wet soil. Roots in consistently damp potting mix develop rot within weeks, and the plant dies from the crown down while the leaves still look relatively normal on the outside. That part of the advice is right. Here is the part that is almost never mentioned. Indoor rosemary in winter can also die from too little water, specifically from dehydration caused by dry air, not dry soil. Heated indoor air during winter in most homes drops to 20 to 30% humidity. That is drier than the Mojave Desert. Rosemary's needle-like leaves lose moisture rapidly in air that dry. If the root system cannot replace that moisture fast enough, the foliage desiccates from the tips inward while the soil looks fine. The plant dies of thirst while the owner thinks they are correctly letting it dry out between waterings. The correct approach is to water when the top inch of soil is dry, but before the entire root ball has gone completely desiccated. Roughly every 4 to 5 days in a container in summer, every 7 to 10 days indoors in winter depending on your home's air. Check the soil rather than following a fixed schedule. Schedules do not account for the variables that change how fast soil dries. For the winter humidity problem, here is the fix. Fill your drainage saucer with a layer of small stones or pebbles and keep water in it up to just below the top of the stones. Set the pot on the stones so the base of the pot sits above the water line rather than in contact with it. As the water evaporates, it raises the humidity in the immediate vicinity of the plant without ever wetting the roots. This is the single most effective intervention for indoor rosemary in heated winter air. Lesson 4. The soil change that transforms everything. Standard potting mix is engineered to hold moisture consistently. That is exactly what it should do for the tropical plants most people grow indoors. For rosemary, it is a slow death sentence. A potting mix that holds water for 3 days after watering is giving rosemary roots 3 days of sustained wet contact that progressively destroys the root system from the outside in. Rosemary needs a mix that drains in seconds rather than hours. The target texture is visibly gritty, almost uncomfortably coarse to the touch. Mix standard potting soil with 30 to 50% perlite, coarse horticultural sand, or fine gravel until the blend feels more like aggregate than soil. When you water, the excess should run straight through and out the drainage holes within seconds of being poured on. If water pools on the surface before soaking in, the mix is still too dense. A cactus and succulent mix used straight from the bag also works. The drainage requirements of succulents and rosemary are nearly identical, which is why those mixes translate directly. The container matters as much as the mix. Terracotta is the correct choice for rosemary. It wicks excess moisture out through the pot wall continuously, which means the soil dries faster after watering, and the root zone never stays wet as long as it would in plastic or glazed ceramic. For a plant that demands fast-drying conditions, a pot that actively participates in that drying process is a meaningful advantage. Lesson 5. The invisible killer nobody mentions. Rosemary evolved on windswept coastal hillsides where air moves through the foliage continuously. That constant movement does two things. It keeps humidity low around the needle surface, preventing the fungal conditions that cause powdery mildew, and it dries the foliage rapidly after rain or morning dew, reducing the window where moisture sits on the needles long enough for disease to establish. Indoor environments have almost no natural air movement. Rooms with closed windows and no airflow create stagnant, humid pockets around dense foliage that are ideal for powdery mildew development. This is why rosemary that looks perfectly healthy in autumn begins showing white, dusty patches across the lower foliage by January. The plant was not diseased when it came in. The environment it was placed in created the conditions for disease to develop. The fix is a small fan running on low near the plant for several hours daily. Not blowing directly on the plant at high speed, just creating circulation in the room that keeps air moving across the foliage. This single addition reduces powdery mildew incidence in indoor rosemary dramatically. Position the plant where it gets the most natural air movement available, near a window that opens regularly, away from corners where air stagnates. When the weather allows, move it outside. Outdoor air movement, even on still days, is vastly better than the stillest indoor environment. Lesson 6. Prune it like a shrub, not like an herb. Most people harvest rosemary by snipping the tips of whatever stems are within reach and leaving everything else alone. That approach gradually produces a plant with a dense green exterior and a bare woody interior that has no foliage, no flexibility, and no capacity to regenerate if something goes wrong. Once rosemary goes fully woody in the center, those woody stems will not produce new foliage. The plant becomes a hollow shell. The correct approach is to prune consistently throughout the growing season rather than waiting for one annual cutback. After flowering, and again in midsummer, cut stems back by about 1/3. Always cut to a point just above a leaf node or lateral branch. The cut end will produce new growth from that node rather than dying back as a stub. Never cut into the hard woody section below where leaves are growing. That woody tissue does not regenerate under most circumstances. Light, consistent pruning produces a plant that stays dense from the base up, generates more harvestable material over the season than occasional heavy cutting, and maintains the bushy form that allows light and air to penetrate the interior. Think of it as shaping a small hedge rather than harvesting a pot herb. That mental shift produces completely different results. If Lesson 6 just changed how you have been harvesting rosemary, subscribe now. This channel publishes plant care built on actual biology every single week. Hit that button so the next video reaches you the moment it goes live. Lesson 7. The transition mistake that kills healthy plants overnight. This is the lesson that explains the most baffling rosemary failure. The plant that spends a full productive summer outdoors, looks completely healthy in September, and is dead by November despite careful indoor care. It was not killed by overwintering, it was killed by the transition. A rosemary plant that has been in full outdoor sun all summer is running on 8 or more hours of intense direct light daily. Moving it directly from that environment onto a kitchen counter or a dim indoor windowsill is the equivalent of asking someone to go from running marathons to complete bed rest overnight. The plant's photosynthetic system is calibrated for high light. Dropping it suddenly into low light causes a rapid physiological adjustment that the plant often cannot survive. It drops leaves, exhausts its energy reserves, and declines faster than the new location can be identified as the problem. The solution is a 2-week gradual transition in both directions. Before bringing rosemary in for autumn, begin moving it to progressively shadier outdoor locations over 2 weeks. First partial shade, then deeper shade, then inside to the brightest available window. This acclimates the foliage to decreasing light levels gradually, so the adjustment does not overwhelm the plant's ability to compensate. Some leaf drop during the first few weeks indoors is normal. It is a stress response, not a death spiral. Check the stems by scratching the bark lightly with a fingernail. Green tissue underneath means the plant is alive and recovering. Gray or brown tissue means the decline has reached the stems. In spring, reverse the process. A plant coming off 4 months of weak indoor light cannot handle direct outdoor sun without scorching the foliage. Move it to a shaded outdoor spot for a week, then partial sun for a week, then full sun. The 2-week rule in both directions prevents the sudden death that gives rosemary its unfair reputation as difficult to overwinter. Lesson 8. One healthy plant becomes unlimited plants for free. Rosemary propagates from stem cuttings with reliable success, and it is one of the easiest propagation projects available for any gardener. The economics are compelling. A $4 plant becomes a dozen plants at no additional cost, and the cuttings root well enough that even a first attempt usually succeeds. Take 4-inch cuttings from the tips of actively growing stems in spring or early summer. Choose stems that are semi-hardwood, firm and slightly woody at the base but still flexible and green at the tip. Strip the lower 2 inches of needles completely, leaving a clean bare stem at the bottom and a tuft of foliage at the top. The stripped section is what goes into the rooting medium. 2 methods work. Water rooting is faster and lets you watch progress. Place the stripped stems in a glass of water in bright indirect light and change the water weekly. Roots typically emerge within 3 to 4 weeks. Once roots reach an inch or 2 in length, transplant into a gritty soil mix. Soil rooting takes 6 to 8 weeks but produces slightly stronger root systems. Push the stripped end 2 inches into moist perlite or a gritty mix. Keep it consistently damp but not wet in bright indirect light, and resist pulling the cutting to check progress. After 6 weeks, give it a gentle upward tug. Resistance means roots have formed. One plant can supply 10 to 12 cuttings per season without being harmed as long as you never remove more than 1/3 of the total foliage volume at a single harvest. Take cuttings from different areas of the plant rather than stripping one section completely. The mother plant regenerates the harvested growth within a few weeks and remains productive. Varieties worth knowing before you buy. Tuscan Blue is the benchmark culinary variety. Broad needles, high essential oil concentration, intense flavor that professional kitchens favor. It grows upright and dense, handles container culture well, and produces consistently strong harvests. If you are growing rosemary primarily for cooking, this is the variety to start with. ARP is the cold hardiness standard for northern growers. Developed and trialed in Texas and tested extensively across the country, ARP survives Zone 6 winters reliably and has been documented surviving Zone 5 in sheltered microclimates with heavy mulch. If you are in the Midwest or Northeast and want a rosemary that overwinters in the ground rather than coming inside every autumn, ARP is the variety that gives you the best chance of success. Salem handles the reduced light of indoor winters better than most varieties because it is less sensitive to shortened day length, the physiological trigger that causes many rosemary cultivars to decline rapidly indoors between November and February. If you have lost rosemary plants to winter decline despite careful attention, switching to Salem before concluding that indoor rosemary is impossible for you is worth trying. Prostrate varieties including Irene and Huntington Carpet are trailing forms that cascade beautifully over container edges and raised beds. They are ornamental as well as functional, but are less cold-hardy than upright types, Zone 8 and warmer in the ground, or container plants that come inside for winter in colder climates. Why stress makes rosemary taste better? The fragrance and flavor of rosemary come from volatile organic compounds concentrated in tiny oil glands on the surface of each needle, primarily cineole, alpha-pinene, and camphor. When you brush the plant or crush a needle between your fingers, those glands rupture and release the aromatic oils in that instant burst of scent. Here is what makes rosemary genuinely unusual among culinary herbs. Commercial essential oil research has consistently documented that rosemary plants grown in poor, fast-draining soil with full sun and periodic drought stress produce significantly higher concentrations of these compounds than plants grown in rich, moist, comfortable conditions. The stress response includes upregulating oil production, which the plant uses as a defense against UV radiation, insect damage, and water loss through the needle surface. This means the care practices that keep rosemary alive, lean, gritty soil, full sun, infrequent watering, are the same practices that make it more fragrant and more flavorful. A rosemary plant grown in comfortable conditions with regular feeding and consistent moisture will taste noticeably milder and smell less intense than one that has been grown a little rough. The plant rewards what looks like neglect with the very quality you are growing it for. Comfort produces bland rosemary. Controlled stress produces the intense piney resinous flavor that makes it irreplaceable in cooking. Getting the most from what you grow. Fresh rosemary is substantially more aromatic than dried because the volatile oils have not had time to dissipate. Harvest in the morning after dew has dried, but before the heat of the day peaks. Oil concentration in the needles is highest at that window. For long cooking dishes like roasts, braises, and stews, add whole sprigs early and pull them before serving. The slow heat extracts the oils gradually and infuses the dish deeply without burning off the top notes. For quick cooking dishes or finishing, strip the needles and add them in the final minutes of cooking. Rosemary's volatile compounds evaporate with prolonged heat exposure. Adding it late preserves the bright, sharp, aromatic quality that makes fresh rosemary distinct from anything that comes in a jar. The flowers are edible and most people never see them because the plant is either struggling or being harvested too aggressively to bloom. A healthy, well-lit rosemary that has been in place for a year or more produces small blue or pale purple flowers in spring. They carry a milder version of the leaf flavor and make striking garnishes on roasted vegetables, cheese boards, and cocktails. Let the plant bloom at least once. The flowers are worth the wait. What changes when you get this right? Rosemary is not difficult, it is specific. It has a narrow set of requirements that differ sharply from the plants most gardeners are used to managing, and those differences are not intuitive until someone explains the biology behind them. Once that biology is clear, Mediterranean coastal shrub, not tropical houseplant, every requirement makes immediate logical sense. Maximum light, fast-draining gritty soil, terracotta containers, airflow around the foliage, infrequent but thorough watering, gradual transitions between environments, consistent pruning rather than occasional heavy cutting, cold-hardy varieties for northern growers, Salem for difficult indoor winters. None of those things are complicated. They are just different from what most indoor plant care looks like. The gardeners who struggle with rosemary year after year are not doing it wrong in general. They are doing it wrong specifically for this plant. Adjust for what rosemary actually is rather than what it looks like it should be, and the results change immediately and permanently. Tell me in the comments what your biggest rosemary struggle has been. Indoor decline over winter, outdoor plants that never produce well, the transition between seasons, or something else entirely. Because the specific challenge you name is almost certainly shared by someone else reading the comments right now, and your description of what you tried and what happened might give them the piece they have been missing. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this video changed how you understand rosemary, that is exactly what this channel publishes every single week. Plant care built on biology, not generic advice. Subscribe now so the next video finds you directly the moment it goes live. Hit that button now.